Paddington 2, the movie storybook. It was the height of summer in London as Paddington Bear sat down to write his fortnightly letter to his beloved Aunt Lucy in Peru. Dear Aunt Lucy, it's been a very busy summer in Windsor Gardens. Mrs. Brown has decided to swim the English Channel. She trains every morning in the lake in Hyde Park. Judy has found an old printing press at school and I've been helping her set up her own newspaper. Jonathan is starting big school this year. He's decided that if he's going to make any friends, he needs to change his image. He's calling himself J-Dog, likes Kung Fu, and is definitely not into steam trains. And Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is having what Mrs. Bird calls a full-blown midlife crisis and has taken up a little-known form of yoga called chakrobatics. I'm sure he'll get better at it very soon. As for me, I've made lots of friends in London. Mademoiselle Dubois, the cyclist, she gives me a ride every morning. Dr. Jaffrey, who is always forgetting his keys. And Mrs. Kitts, who runs the newspaper kiosk with her parrot feathers. Not forgetting, of course, my dear old friend Mr. Gruber, who runs Gruber's Antiques. People are awfully kind to me. I do hope if you could see me, you'd be pleased. Lots of love from Paddington. Paddington was going to Mr. Gruber's shop that very day to look for the perfect present for his Aunt Lucy, who would be celebrating her 100th birthday that year. I've just had a visit from Madame Kozlova, Mr. Gruber told Paddington. She runs the steam fair that's come to town. She was having a clear-out and found a trunk of old memorabilia that she wants me to sell for her. Rummaging through the trunk, Paddington found a beautiful pop-up book all about London. Apparently, it was handmade by Madame Kozlova's great-grandmother. It wasn't cheap to buy, but it was perfect. Aunt Lucy always dreamed of coming to London, Paddington said excitedly. If she saw this, it would be as if she were finally here. I'm going to get a job and buy that book. That evening, the Browns and Paddington visited Madame Kozlova's steam fair. It was being opened by the actor Phoenix Buchanan, who was once very famous, but now made dog food commercials. He also happened to be a neighbor of the Browns and one of Mr. Brown's insurance clients. Paddington told Phoenix all about the pop-up book he wanted to buy for his Aunt Lucy. Phoenix was extremely interested. After a couple of false starts, Paddington found a job he was good at, window cleaning. Before long, he had a jar full of money and realized that soon he'd have enough to buy Aunt Lucy the pop-up book for her birthday. He was so excited, he decided to go past Mr. Gruber's shop on his way home to take another look at the book through the shop window. It was every bit as beautiful as Paddington remembered. As he was admiring it, he heard the tinkling of broken glass from the side of the shop. Someone was climbing in through Mr. Gruber's window. "Stop, thief!" cried Paddington. "Lawks," the intruder gasped, hastily pulling himself inside. Paddington climbed in the window after him, following the thief as he burst out again through the front door. The burglar alarm began to shriek as Paddington glanced at the glass case. The pop-up book was gone. Paddington gave chase after the thief, but as he raced out of the shop, the police arrived just behind him. "Robbery in progress at Gruber's Antiques. Suspect is a small bear in a duffel coat and a red hat." Paddington ran and ran as fast as he could. At last, he caught up with the burglar. "All right," said the thief. "You got me." And with that, he disappeared in a puff of smoke, just as the police arrived. "Put your, paws in the air," demanded the policewoman. "But I'm not the thief," insisted Paddington. "I was chasing the thief, and then he—" "What? Disappeared? In a puff of smoke?" she said sarcastically. "Well, yes," answered poor Paddington helplessly. The Browns were horrified when Paddington was brought home by the police. "There must be some mistake," insisted Mr. Brown. "No mistake, sir," said the policeman, shaking his head. "Caught red-handed robbing Gruber's Antiques." "Well, well, well," called Mr. Curry, the Browns' mean-spirited neighbor. "The truth is out. We opened our hearts and doors to that bear. Well, you did, and all along he was robbing you blind. I hate to say I told you so, but I definitely did tell you so." Paddington's neighbours and friends muttered anxiously amongst themselves as the confused bear was driven away in the back of a police van, except for one neighbour, who sat in a secret room in his attic nearby, removing his disguise. It would appear that the thief was in fact none other than Phoenix Buchanan. As he took off his makeup, Phoenix revealed his wicked plan. "I will return to glory," he declared, "with the greatest one-man show the West End has ever seen. It'll cost a fortune, but if I'm right, a fortune's exactly what this pop-up book will unlock. All we need to do," he muttered, peering at a pop-up of the Tower of London, "is follow the clues in Madame Kozlova's book." The next day, Paddington's case was heard in court. Mr. Gruber was the first on the witness stand. "Tell me, Mr. Gruber," asked the lawyer disapprovingly, "did Paddington Brown show an interest in the pop-up book before it was stolen?" "Oh yes," Mr. Gruber nodded. "Paddington loved the book. He had his heart set on it." "You discussed how expensive it was?" she asked. "Yes, but he was earning the money. I refused to believe that Paddington would ever burglarize my shop." Finally, Phoenix Buchanan was called to the stand. "Mr. Buchanan, you were an eyewitness to the events?" "Quite so. I was up late writing my forthcoming one-man show when I heard a hullabaloo. That's when I saw Paddington rushing down the street. And Mrs. Brown drew this based on the bear's description of the man he claims he was chasing. Did you see him?" asked the lawyer. "Handsome devil, isn't he? Strong cheekbones, noble forehead, dazzling eyes. But did you see him?" "Alas, I did not. It was no good." The judge banged his gavel. "Paddington Brown, I hereby sentence you to 10 years for grand theft." "Dear Aunt Lucy, a great deal has happened since I last wrote. I'm afraid there's been a bit of a mix-up and I've had to leave Windsor Gardens and move somewhere else. It's not quite as charming as the Browns' house, but it's not all bad. It's a period property. In fact, it's one of the most substantial Victorian buildings in London, and the security arrangements are second to none. The Browns have promised to do all they can to bring me home. I can't wait to see them, and they're bound to have sorted it all out. In the meantime, I think I'll try to get to know the neighbours. Your loving nephew, Paddington." And meanwhile, the Browns and Mrs. Bird were desperate to prove Paddington's innocence. And Judy printed a special edition of her paper, and Jonathan stuck up posters all over the neighborhood. "I think there's something fishy about this whole business," sighed Mrs. Brown. "I mean, of all the treasures, why did the thief only take the pop-up book?" "He probably didn't know much about antiques," shrugged Mr. Brown. "He hardly looks the sort." "Maybe, or maybe, he knows something about the pop-up book that we don't." Unfortunately, Paddington's attempts to get on with his fellow prisoners didn't go as well as he'd hoped, and when he accidentally put a red sock in with the prison laundry and dyed everyone's uniforms pink, he became positively unpopular. "Afternoon, chaps," he said as he sat down to eat with his fellow inmates. "If you ask me, the pink really brightens things up." Seeing their expressions, Paddington hastily changed the subject and asked what exactly was the slop they all had in their bowls. Nobody knew, and nor did anyone dare ask Knuckles, the prison chef. "Tell you what, son," said a prisoner called T-Bone. "You get Knuckles to change the menu, and we might all forgive you for making us look like a bunch of pink flamingos." Paddington couldn't help feeling that T-Bone's smile was a little threatening, but reminding himself of Aunt Lucy's saying, "If you look for the good in people, you'll find it," he approached the prison chef for a friendly chat about his food. Although he quickly realized he may have misjudged the situation somewhat. As Paddington looked up at Knuckles' furious face, he had a flash of inspiration. He removed the emergency sandwich from beneath his hat and shoved it into Knuckles' mouth. "What is it?" asked Knuckles. "It's marmalade," Paddington stammered. "Marmalade?" breathed Knuckles in wonder. "You know how to make this?" From that moment on, Paddington was under Knuckles' protection. There was one condition. Paddington was to teach him everything he knew about making marmalade. And back at Windsor Gardens, Mrs. Brown couldn't shake the feeling that the thief knew something important about the pop-up book, so the Browns and Mrs. Bird paid a visit to the Steam Fair to see Madame Kozlova to find out more about it. And what a story Madame Kozlova had to tell. My great-grandmother who started this fair was the greatest showwoman of her generation, as she told them. She could tame lions, breathe fire, and swallow swords, but she was most famous for her trapeze act. They called her the Flying Swan. Wherever she went, she was showered with gifts, and she made a fortune. But where there is a fortune, there is also a jealousy. The magician, a brilliant but selfish man, wanted a fortune for himself, so one night he cut the ropes of her trapeze, and the flying swan became the dying swan. As she lay there, he pretended to help her, but in fact stole a key she kept on a chain around her neck. The magician went to a caravan and opened a strong box with a key, but instead of a treasure, all he found was a handmade pop-up book of London. The police came after him. They had him cornered, but just as they were about to arrest him, the magician vanished in a puff of smoke and was never heard of again. "There's got to be something special about that pop-up book," Mrs. Brown said to Mr. Brown later that evening. "Madame Kozlova said there are 12 different landmarks in it. I wonder whether they're, I don't know, clues?" "Clues?" scoffed Mr. Brown. "To where she hid her fortune," exclaimed Mrs. Brown, warming to her theme. "And that's why the thief stole it from Mr. Gruber." Mr. Brown was not convinced, but Mrs. Brown wouldn't be swayed. "I think there's more to him than meets the eye," she said. "I think he somehow knew about the Kozlova fortune and is somewhere out there, right now, trying to find it." As Mrs. Brown pondered, outside St. Paul's Cathedral, a group of nuns made their way slowly and gracefully up the steps and then began a reverent procession towards the altar. But as they went, one of them slipped away and sneaked up a winding staircase onto a balcony right in the magnificent dome, the Whispering Gallery. It was not a nun at all. It was Phoenix Buchanan. There he found what he was looking for, the letter A, carved into the marble base of an angel statue. Just before he was spotted by a security guard, Phoenix ran, accidentally knocking the statue over the railings, but just managed to escape without being caught. Across town, Knuckles woke Padington for his secret marmalade-making lesson. He seemed to think, however, that this should involve Padington doing all the work while he read his paper. Fortunately, after Padington used one of his hard stares, Knuckles became much more cooperative. In fact, they worked rather well together. Finally, the marmalade was ready. "Well?" asked Knuckles anxiously. "Is it any good?" "There's only one way to find out," answered Padington. The next morning, and much to Knuckles' surprise, his marmalade received a standing ovation. In fact, it went down so well that a few of the prisoners suggested other recipes they could make too. "I can do strawberry panna cotta with a pomegranate glaze," offered T-Bone. Before long, the canteen and indeed the whole prison became a different place altogether, and it was all thanks to Paddington's influence, not to mention Aunt Lucy's, who always said, "If you're kind and polite, the world will be right." Things were looking up in the prison, but Paddington still couldn't wait for his monthly visit from the Browns. He felt sure they would have good news for him. Delighted to see their little friend again, the Browns and Mrs. Bird explained their new theory to him. 3 shadowy individuals have been seen snooping around 3 London landmarks in the past week," said Mrs. Brown. "We think the thief is part of a criminal gang," said Judy. "Using the pop-up book as a treasure map," finished Jonathan. "So, do you know who they are?" asked Paddington. There was a pause. "Not yet, dearie." Mrs. Bird shook her head. "Maybe I should take a look," said Knuckles, popping up with the rest of Paddington's new friends. "If anyone can recognize a criminal, it's us." But no one knew the men in the pictures. "I'm sorry to say it, kid," sighed Knuckles, "but I think your family is barking up the wrong tree. A nun, a beef-eater, and a king sounds more like a fancy dress party than a criminal gang." "Then what are we going to do now?" Paddington wondered. No one knew the answer to this. Time passed, and Paddington remained in prison. The Browns kept handing out leaflets, posters, and newspapers protesting his innocence. Then, one winter morning, as Mrs. Brown dropped her latest bundle at Mrs. Kidd's newspaper kiosk, she heard her name being called. She turned to see Phoenix Buchanan standing at his balcony. "Come on in," he called. "I want to hear all about the investigation." But Phoenix wasn't really interested in the investigation. Once he'd established that it hadn't got anywhere, he told Mrs. Brown, "Well, I've got some news that might turn that little frown upside down. It looks like the funding is coming through for my one-man show. An evening of monologues and song, all my greatest creations back on stage. I call it The Phoenix Rises." And Mrs. Brown sighed. "It seems so strange that Paddington's in prison, but life carries on." "I know. It must be hard to accept he won, the man with the dazzling blue eyes," Phoenix agreed. "How do you know he had blue eyes?" she replied sharply. Phoenix faltered. "The man on the poster. Your wonderful drawing." "It was a pencil sketch." Suddenly, the penny dropped. He was the man, the thief. It was him, Phoenix Buchanan. "Phoenix Buchanan?" snorted Mr. Brown. Then Mrs. Brown explained her theory to the family later. "Let's just return to planet Earth for one moment. Phoenix Buchanan is a highly respected actor. He is not a petty thief. And might I remind you that you don't actually have any proof?" Given that Phoenix was also a member of Mr. Brown's insurance company's Platinum Club and a very important client, it was going to take a lot to change Mr. Brown's mind. But Mrs. Bird had a plan, and she was not the only one. Meanwhile, back in the prison, "Psst, Paddington." Paddington scrambled up the central heating pipes in his cell and opened up the air vent. "Knuckles?" It was not just Knuckles, but Fibs and Spoon too. The three of them told Paddington they were planning to escape and he should join them. Then they could find the book thief and clear Paddington's name. But the little bear wasn't sure. He didn't think Aunt Lucy would approve. "The Browns will come through for me," he assured his friends. "You'll see." "You might not want to hear this, kid," said Knuckles gently. "But sooner or later, your family will give up on you." "They'll miss one visit, then two," sighed Spoon. "Before you know it, they'll have abandoned you altogether," Knuckles finished. "You're wrong," exclaimed Paddington. "You're all wrong. The Browns aren't like that." The next morning, Mrs. Bird's plan was put into action. Mrs. Brown hid inside a large hamper addressed to Phoenix's house. Meanwhile, a fake phone call from Phoenix's agent set up by Jonathan and Judy lured him out of the building. Mrs. Brown was free to search Phoenix's empty house. Mr. Brown, brushing his teeth in his pajamas, spotted Mrs. Brown through the bathroom window. "What the—" he exclaimed, and hurried over to find out what his wife was up to. But Mrs. Brown had already found a note that looked interesting. "Saturday, 06:35, where all your dreams come true." And reluctantly, Mr. Brown joined her in looking for the pop-up book. They searched every room and were just about ready to give up when they found the secret attic. "Look at all these costumes," exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Good grief, he's a weirdo." Meanwhile, Phoenix realized he'd forgotten his cravat and turned back to get it. Hearing him come in, Mr. and Mrs. Brown tried their best to hide, but it was not long before Phoenix spotted Mr. Brown's legs poking out from behind the sofa. "Henry?" asked Phoenix in surprise. "Phoenix," said Mr. Brown, climbing out sheepishly. He realized some explanation was needed. For our Platinum Club members, we perform an annual full home inspection to verify your security arrangements." It all seemed very unlikely, especially since Mr. Brown was still in his pajamas and Mrs. Brown popped out from behind the curtain too. But Phoenix seemed to believe their story. He smiled as he showed them out. Before sprinting up to his attic to check that the pop-up book was still where he had hidden it. That was close, he sighed in relief. "Hold your nerve," he told himself. "I've followed the clues all the way across London. At first, I thought they were just a bundle of letters from the alphabet. But then I realized they're musical notes, and I know just where to play them." At the police station, the Browns reported what they had discovered, but without evidence. They were told it proved nothing. Crestfallen, they made their way out of the station, only to realize that they had missed their visiting hour with Paddington. Paddington waited and waited for the Browns, but no one came. He wondered whether his new friends were right. Maybe his family would forget him eventually. Sadly, he decided the only thing for it was to escape with the prisoners who had promised to help him clear his name. Everything went to plan, and before the night was out, Paddington found himself floating over London in a homemade hot air balloon with his fellow fugitives. Once they reached the East End docks, the prisoners brought the balloon down by an old factory on the river. "There she is, our ticket out of here." Knuckles pointed to a seaplane waiting on the river. Paddington stopped short. "But aren't we going to clear my name?" Knuckles shrugged sheepishly. "Change of plan. We're leaving the country," grinned Spoon. "But you said—" "You lied to me," faltered Paddington. "We've done you a favor. If we had told you the truth, you'd never have come," protested Knuckles. Paddington didn't want to leave the country. He wanted to clear his name and go home to the Browns. Betrayed and upset, he turned and ran. Paddington spotted a phone box down a side alley. He dialed the Browns' number, but the phone clicked to voicemail. Heartbroken, Paddington left a message and walked away, with no idea where he was going. Then a magical thing happened. The phone rang. Hardly daring to hope, the little bear ran to answer it. "Paddington?" It was Mrs. Brown. Yes, it's Paddington," he cried, relief flooding through him. Joyfully, the family gathered round the phone, clamoring to tell Paddington how much they loved him, how they'd been up all night worrying. "And we know who the thief is," called Judy. "It's Phoenix Buchanan." "Mr. Buchanan?" repeated Paddington, shocked. "But he's disappeared into thin air," said Mrs. Bird. "We've been searching for him all night. All we know is that at 06:35 today he'll be where all your dreams come true, whatever that means," Mrs. Brown told Paddington. "I've seen that before," said Paddington slowly, "on the pop-up book and the organ at the steam fair." "That must be where Madame Koslova hid her fortune," cried Jonathan. "The fair's leaving today," gasped Judy. "At 06:35. Mrs. Brown suddenly pieced it all together. "There's still time," said Mrs. Bird, looking at her watch. "Paddington, get to the station," exclaimed Mr. Brown. "If you can find Phoenix and get hold of that book, we can prove everything." But the Browns' car wouldn't start. And worse, Mr. Curry had heard that Paddington had escaped and was standing in their way with a megaphone and his neighborhood panic board set to wild hysteria. "Get back to your homes," cried Mr. Curry. But Paddington's neighbors took no notice. "Go and bring Paddington home," smiled Dr. Jaffrey, as he and the other neighbors gave the car a push start. Meanwhile, Paddington had arrived at the station before the Browns, managing to get on board the fair steam train at the same time as the familiar-looking train guard. The Browns and Mrs. Bird arrived just a second too late. They chased after the fair's train as it pulled out of the station. "We've got to catch up with that train," cried Mrs. Brown. Jonathan spotted a magnificent old Pullman steam train on the other platform. "I've got an idea," he said. Back on the moving train, the familiar-looking guard had removed his wig and was standing before Madame Koslova's organ. "Well, grandfather," Phoenix addressed the carving of the wicked magician on the front. "The moment of truth." Kneeling down, he played a series of 12 notes. From the depths of the organ, the box of treasure arose. "Hello," breathed Phoenix. "Aren't you pretty?" Just then, he caught sight of Paddington hanging through the skylight trying to grab hold of the pop-up book. A thrilling chase followed, in which the Pullman, driven by Jonathan, pulled alongside the fair's train and Paddington tried to make his way across to safety. But before he could get across, Phoenix locked Paddington in the last coach of the train and set it loose. The others watched helplessly as Paddington's runaway carriage trundled down a broken track and tipped into the swirling river below. Mrs. Brown didn't hesitate. She dived in after Paddington. She swam fast to the sinking carriage and pulled on the door. It opened a little, but the chain was too strong. Paddington was trapped. Mrs. Brown tugged and tugged at the door handle, but the chain wouldn't budge. Paddington and Mrs. Brown looked at each other hopelessly through the crack in the door. Suddenly, more hands were there, heaving at the door, and all at once the chain gave. The door burst open, and Paddington was free. Mrs. Brown and Paddington burst from the surface of the water, gasping for air, and Knuckles, Spoon, and Fibs emerged too, their seaplane bobbing on the water nearby. "Knuckles," spluttered Paddington in amazement, "what made you change your mind?" "Can't make marmalade on my own now, can I?" the big man winked. Paddington smiled happily. At last, a very tired Paddington was back at 32 Windsor Gardens where he belonged. The police had realized there had been a terrible mix-up, so they arrested Phoenix, and Paddington was a free bear. "You've been asleep for 3 days," Jonathan told him when he opened his eyes. "But that means it's too late to send Aunt Lucy a birthday present. She's going to wake up on her 100th birthday and think I've forgotten her." "Come with us," smiled Mr. Brown. Baffled, Paddington followed the Browns downstairs. The hallway was overflowing with people. It seemed the whole neighborhood had come to wish him well. "Oh, thank you, everyone. But what about Aunt Lucy?" Just then, the doorbell rang. "Why don't you go and answer it?" smiled Mrs. Brown. Standing on the doorstep, in the snow, was Aunt Lucy. "Hello, Paddington, dear." Paddington's face lit up with perfect joy. "Happy birthday, Aunt Lucy." The end.